All right. Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Iowa Learning Farm Conservation webinar. Again, Iowa Learning Farms, we're excited this year to be celebrating 20 years. And so keep an eye out for events, various events that might be coming up. Certainly one of the important aspects of the Learning Farms is to facilitate this webinar series. And so we're really fortunate to have Dr. Katherine Dentzman here to talk to us today. This is rescheduled from last year, from 2023, but we are excited she was willing to reschedule and talk to us this year. As always, if you have questions or comments, feel free to type those in the chat box. Today, Dr. Dentzman is going to talk to us about community approaches to pesticide resistance management. And again, if you have questions or comments, feel free to type those in the chat box. With that, the virtual floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you guys for having me. I'm very excited to be here and talk about some of my research, particularly related to pesticide resistance management. So I'm a rural sociologist at Iowa State University. And for a long time, ever since my dissertation work, I've been looking at pesticide resistance from a human perspective. So basically looking at why people make the management choices that they make, what kind of information they use, and what kind of support they need. Because that's often what I really find, is that it's not that people don't know what to do. It's that they know what to do, but there's these different barriers in their way to managing pesticide resistance more effectively. So really what that's come around to for me in a lot of ways is this notion of a community-based approach to pesticide resistance management. And you'll see kind of some of the reasons why I think that might be particularly effective, but kind of getting all of these different stakeholders in a community together to work on the problem is probably going to be a lot more effective than people trying to approach it in an individual way. So I'm sure you all know what pesticide resistance is, but just to get us all kind of on the same page, that is the inherited ability of a pest to survive and reproduce following exposure to a dose of pesticides that is normally lethal. So this has become an increasing issue in the US, and particularly with glyphosate. So if you're using one pesticide, I'm sure, again, as you all know, things tend to develop a resistance to that one mode of action. So if you're using one technique, Mother Nature is going to evolve and it won't be as effective anymore. And if we look at a map here of estimated agricultural use of glyphosate, this is a map from 1995, and it shows the pounds per square mile. And so we have Iowa pretty darkly colored in, but you can see that it really increased up in 2019, where Iowa is completely dark brown. We have really just an astonishing amount of glyphosate application. And one of the results of that has been a significant increase in the numbers of glyphosate-resistant weeds. So if you check out Dr. Ian Heap's website, weedscience.org, definitely suggest it. It's super interesting, and he has a ton of data, and you can get local data as well if you're interested in that. But he's been tracking different kinds of resistance to different herbicides over time. And so you can see the number of weed species that are resistant to glyphosate really just skyrocketing from 1996 or so up into the 2020s. So one of the approaches, obviously, to that has been to look at, okay, what other chemistries can we use? Part of the issue is that we're also seeing an increase in the number of species with resistance to multiple modes of action. So we have a lot of weed species that are now resistant to 2, some that are resistant to 3, 4, 5, and even a couple that are resistant to 6 or 7 different modes of action. So we have this increasing pesticide resistance issue, right? And according to Ian Heap's map, you can look at Iowa, and Iowa right now has about 17 different unique resistant weeds. So maybe not as bad as some other states. So California is a little darker than us in that, but we still definitely have this problem. Obviously, this is a big problem for growers and for all sorts of different agricultural stakeholders. Some of the consequences of resistance management include higher weed management costs, and there's been a variety of research on this, which is pretty interesting. And one of those studies was done in Georgia and looked at herbicide-resistant Palmer amaranth in cotton and found that the presence of this weed increased management costs by 58%. And so that was done back in 2010. It's probably evolved even more by now. Obviously, you can deal with things like lower crop yields. Increased tillage is something that we're seeing evolve kind of along with pesticide resistance and herbicide resistance, where there have been studies showing that in locations where there is more resistance, people tend to actually move away from conservation tillage and increase their tillage. We're also seeing in some cases application of more volatile herbicides. And interestingly, also from my perspective as a sociologist, we're seeing some societal unrest. So we've seen a lot of tension between growers in terms of who's using what pesticide, how they're using it. We see this a lot with dicamba and various legislation related to dicamba. So there are all sorts of economic impacts. There's agronomic impacts as well, but there's also social impacts and really a strong social dimension to this. There's also been a lot of research into what to do about herbicide resistance and pesticide resistance. And so there's a pretty famous paper from Jason Norsworthy et al. In 2016 that outlines a series of best management practices for dealing with herbicide resistance. And so I'm just going to run through them very quickly. He has this long list. So it's understanding the biology of weeds, using a diversified approach focused on the seed bank, maintaining weed-free fields, planting weed-free crop seed, scouting fields routinely, using multiple modes of action, using labeled herbicide rates, emphasizing cultural management, integrating mechanical and biological management, prevent movement of weed seeds, manage weed seeds at post-harvest and harvest, and manage field borders, which is like, whew, okay, awesome. So it sounds like we know what to do, right? We have all of these various strategies to actually pretty effectively manage herbicide resistance. The problem that we're running into is that people aren't doing it. And that's when it becomes a sociological question, right? And less maybe an agronomic question, where we have all of these approaches, we have all of these best management practices, but people simply aren't using them. And if you look at these and you look at how many of them there are and how complex they are and how they might be costly or how they might take more time, you can start to see why people might not be doing this. So this is really where pest resistance as a sociological issue enters the picture. So we're all on the same page. Quick definition of sociology, because I certainly didn't know what it was until I took a sociology class in undergrad. But basically, sociology is studying groups of people and their interactions. So we ask questions like, why is society organized how it is? Why does it function or not function very well sometimes? And why do people do what they do? How is this shaped by the society they live in? How is it shaped by their group identity, maybe as farmers or as Iowa farmers or as corn and soybean farmers, as ag advisors, all these different potential identities that people have. So really the question that I kind of formulated from a sociological perspective was, how are farmers making management decisions in light of the societal expectations and constraints that they find themselves in? So when they have this issue of herbicide resistance to deal with, and they have all of these suggestions about how to handle it, how are they actually making those choices and making those decisions? And so my approach to study this is kind of two-pronged, and I've done this probably since like 2015, 2016. So we're going on about 10 years now. And so I'll report from a variety of data, but I collected qualitative data, and this has been in the form of lots of different things. I've done focus groups, I've done interviews, community meetings, listening sessions, content analysis, maybe basically getting out there and talking to people and actually figuring out what they have to say. Then I've also done quantitative research, and so that's more numbers based and less words based, and quantitative has mostly been surveys. So we've got the qualitative, which is kind of like talk to everyone and get all the ideas that they have, get the lay of the land, understand what's happening. And then quantitative is a little more straightforward in terms of sorting out different kinds of themes and actually using numbers and identifying statistically significant trends, things like this. So I've done this in a variety of areas geographically. I've done this over a period of time in a lot of ways. And so I just wanted to share with you some general results on the social context of herbicide resistance and what some of my findings have been around that. Because when I was looking at, okay, why are people making the decisions that they are? And what's preventing them from making decisions that might rather be making or that might be more optimal or best management style? There were really two things that were coming up from kind of this sociological, ideological perspective. And the first one of those was techno-optimism. So techno-optimism is basically this belief that there's going to be a new miracle herbicide that's going to come out and it will solve everything, right? And so people are looking for the next Roundup. People are looking for the next silver bullet. And if they think that that next silver bullet is going to come, well, there's no reason to start doing these integrated pest management practices because something new that's going to be easy and simple and economical and time efficient is going to come out. So if people have that belief, there's really no motivation to start doing this more integrated management. Another thing we were running into was individualism. And so there was really among the farmers that I talked to this really strong belief in the sanctity of farmers' autonomy and agency. And that is not limited to farmers whatsoever. That's part of our culture, right? We are self-sufficient. We tend to be very unique. We value our autonomy. We value our independence. And this is something that is a trait of our society, and it's a trait of farmers as well. But we were running into the issue where you cannot manage pesticide resistance and herbicide resistance as an individual. It's just not possible. And that's because of the mobility of the issue. That's because there's so many different actors affecting what kind of seeds you plant, what kind of chemicals you use. And if you try and just act as an individual, that's going to potentially be ineffective. And there's been a variety of really interesting studies looking at pesticide resistance management and the effectiveness of it if you're doing it, and then if your neighbor is also doing it. And if your neighbor is also doing these kind of best practices, it's so much better for you. But if they aren't, it really negates a lot of the good best management practices that you're doing. So there needs to be more coordination there. And there are a lot of farmers who are really having trouble with the idea of coordinating in that way. So I wanted to share with you some direct quotes from farmers that I interviewed about these two different themes to kind of drive that home. So techno-optimism, we had one grower say, I think we're all probably hoping somewhere in that chemistry, there's something that comes out that's a new version. Yeah, stall long enough, maybe they'll figure something out, give us another product, that's about it. So this was in response to, what should we do about herbicide resistance? And it was basically like, wait for a new chemical. I had another farmer say, you can't tell me that it can't be done. You can't tell me that there ain't a chemical out there to kill that weed. I will never believe it. So again, this very optimistic kind of faith in technology. We also had a farmer say, in other words, trying to keep a company keeping new products moving in the pipeline, because that's what's eventually going to have to happen, is this is never going to go away. You're always going to have an issue with whatever herbicide comes out. So keeping new options coming is more important than really the agricultural practices and all that. We also had a farmer that pointed out that Roundup allowed people to get bigger because it worked so good for so long. You could double your acres easily and get the work done, but I don't see the cultivator coming back out. We're going to have to find chemicals. And the last quote I'll share is, we'd get a silver bullet and everyone loads up their gun with the silver bullet and then just empties it. Well, by then everything starts getting resistant to it. We've got to find another bullet. Well, now we're looking for gold bullets, not silver bullets. So we were seeing this attitude and kind of this belief within farmers that there's going to be a chemical that's going to come out. But it was also sometimes almost not a realistic belief. It was almost a story that people were telling themselves because they realized that they were in a really difficult situation. So it was almost a kind of fatalism where people didn't see any other practical possible options. And they thought, okay, well, there are no other options. I can't get around to doing these other best management practices. They're too time consuming, they're too expensive, et cetera. So it's going to have to be a chemical. So there was really a lot of kind of fatalism going on in these quotes as well. And one of the reasons people saw no other alternatives was this really big belief in individualism. So we also had a question in our focus groups where we asked farmers, what would you do if your neighbor had an infestation of herbicide-resistant weeds? And these are some of the responses to that question. So I had a couple participants say, bite your tongue. I said, huh? And they said, bite your tongue and wait. Harder, yeah, till it bleeds. So very evocative in terms of, if they have a problem, it is none of your business. And then another said, my answer would be nothing. I don't see myself going up and knocking on the door and saying you need to get rid of your weeds. And I think that's going to be a typical answer. Economics have to run the show. Had another say, I had some neighbors come up to me concerned about another neighbor in our area that had issues with spraying, but I mean, nobody did anything about it, but they're concerned. Somebody said, if it's at the back end, maybe if it was a few plants, you could go out there and pull them by hand if they don't fire at you from the house or something. But there are also people who were curious about getting more information from people around them. Where I had somebody say, I do think a lot of my friends, or I do ask a lot of my friends, what did you use? What did you use? And then compare it to what I'm doing. And it would be nice to have a bigger bank of that knowledge. So there was some desire to reach out here. And also a lot of farmers were saying, if my neighbor asked me for advice, absolutely, I would love to help them with it. But there is such kind of this ideology around individualism that it was hard to get past that. And one of the most evocative quotes that I had from participants was, just think, shoot the neighbor, And they all laughed, hoping he'll die soon. Oh, yeah. And this was said absolutely in jest, but you can really kind of read home how strong of a thing this was that you cannot interfere with somebody else. And that makes it really, really hard to collaborate on an issue that is a landscape level issue and not really just a single farm issue that you're going to have a really hard time managing alone. So we also saw some indications that community collaboration was happening in some ways, and also that it might be a way forward to deal with some of these issues and some of these barriers that farmers were telling us they had. So in Iowa, we had a farmer say, I had some neighbors come up to me concerned about another neighbor, but I mean, nobody did anything about it, but they're concerned. So there is awareness, there's concern in communities. Another Iowa farmer said, I know what runs through my mind a lot is what did they do? And I asked my friends, what did you use to compare it? I already shared that one. Then in North Carolina, I had a farmer tell me a story where he was driving along. He saw a field that was really infested. He didn't know the guy, but he actually went out and talked to him. And the farmer was very amenable to that. He agreed and he said, that's not easy, but he knew he had a problem. He didn't know what it was or what to do with it. And he was willing to help him out. So there is a lot of kind of good spirit between farmers and a spirit of collaboration and kind of a desire in some ways to work together on some of these things. There's also some evidence from our survey that community might be a good way to go as far as dealing with some of these barriers. So one of the survey questions we asked, and this was a national survey of corn and soybean farmers, we asked them, should the government develop a policy to require farmers to develop an approved plan to manage herbicide-resistant weeds? And 9% of people agreed at all. So not very many, not too surprising that people don't think the government should develop this required policy. But then we asked the same question, replacing it with a farmer-led local organization. So instead of the government's farmer-led local organization, same question, and it increased to 27%. So people were much more willing to participate in something like this when it was grassroots, when it was coming from their community, and when they were involved in kind of making the rules. And we also found a really interesting trend, which is that if people had herbicide-resistant weeds on their farm, there were kind of two paths that they tended to go down. The first path was towards this techno-optimism, fatalism kind of attitude of, well, there's nothing else I can do about it. I'm going to have to rely on chemicals. And that led to them using more chemicals in their management programs. So people tended to rely on herbicides in that case. But the other direction that it went was to when people kind of acknowledged this greater level of concern and said, hey, this really is a problem. And those people were more likely to talk to their neighbors. They were more likely to engage in their community. And the people who engaged in their community were actually significantly more likely to use integrated weed management practices. So this was really pointing us towards this idea that maybe community can be a way to overcome some of these barriers and give farmers a practical alternative and the kind of support that they need to be able to experiment with different kinds of resistance management approaches. Other things that kind of convinced us this was potentially a good direction to go was that it's been done fairly successfully in some places. So a great example that I like to show people is the Arkansas Zero Tolerance Program. And so the Zero Tolerance Program was a group of farmers. It was a farmer-led local organization, and it was a voluntary program that farmers would sign on to and say, we have zero tolerance for pigweed or Palmer amaranth in our fields. And we'll put a sign in our fields to indicate that we're part of this program, and we will eradicate it. And so you can check that out if you just Google Arkansas Zero Tolerance Program. The University of Arkansas has an extension publication that you can kind of read about that program. And they projected that people who were using this program were really going to reduce the weed seed bank pretty significantly over just 2 years. This was a very successful program in a lot of ways and indicated to us that community, which we kind of theorized from our focus groups and our interviews was going to be important to dealing with this issue, could actually be fairly effective at dealing with this issue, which would be fantastic. So where do we go from there? And that's a really good question is, okay, we know that community is important. We have this idea that maybe it's a way to address some of these issues, but how do we actually form communities? How do we actually start to learn to work together? And that's a much more difficult thing to do. And it involves farmers, obviously, but it involves all sorts of other people as well. So the Arkansas Zero Tolerance Program was in part facilitated by an extension educator from University of Arkansas. And so you've got people in extension, you've got crop advisors. I recently did a national survey with crop advisors and talked to them about how they deal with pesticide resistance. And there's a lot of information that's coming around between crop advisors and their customers. So it's not just about the farmers, it's about that entire kind of stakeholder group. And there can be a lot of different values there, there can be a lot of different trust issues, and a lot of different priorities that you have to kind of bring people together around. Now, the good news is we're not starting from a blank slate. There have been different community management principles that have been pulled out before in various research, and one of the most famous researchers in this area is Elinor Ostrom. And so Elinor Ostrom was an economist and actually won the Nobel Peace Prize for her work on community-based management of natural resources. And she had a couple key principles for getting a community together to work on these kinds of issues. And so these principles involved setting clear boundaries of who's inside the community, what area you're engaged in, being aware of farmer and community differences and needs, so not everyone's going to be the same, allowing the community to lead and govern itself. That was really important. And you saw kind of in our survey results that when it was the government from elsewhere, not so key on that. But when it was a local farmer group, you're involved in making your own decisions, you're much more likely to abide by those decisions. It's also important to establish shared goals and values through active communication. So actually getting people to talk to each other. And in some of the groups that I've been working with, this has been a really hard sticking point because we're seeing a lot of rural decline. We're seeing a lot of farmers move out. We're seeing coffee shops kind of disappear from these locations where people can actually communicate on a regular basis. So that's been kind of a sticking point for us. Also, raising the awareness of the need for community-based management is going to be important. Recognizing individual contributions and struggles, engaging diverse actors, and then starting simple and monitoring progress. So even just getting a community to get together to start talking about what is the problem is going to be great. That's going to make people feel like they are part of a group that is doing something about this, and they are. And then going to be able to kind of initiate these smaller steps that can snowball into this larger initiative. So based on these principles, we were like, okay, we really want to get into this community management. Let's go, let's do it. And so a group in Iowa, and this was actually before I was even at Iowa State University, but the Iowa Pest Resistance Management Program was started basically after a statewide meeting in 2015 that was to address pesticide resistance. So they're like, okay, this is a serious big issue. What are we going to do about it? And this statewide meeting came to the conclusion that a community-based grassroots approach to managing pest resistance issues in Iowa would be potentially a really good way to address some of the problems we're seeing with pesticide resistance. And so we started with 4 pilot communities. And these pilot communities were basically groups and areas that were dealing with pesticide resistance issues and that expressed an interest in talking to us and talking to each other about how they could more effectively manage these problems. And so those communities are Harrison County, who are focusing on herbicide resistance, Story County, also focused on herbicide resistance, Northeast Iowa, looking at soybean aphids, and Northwest Iowa, looking at corn rootworm resistance. And so these pilot studies are ongoing, and we have been working with them fairly continuously over the period of about 5 years or so now after they were established. And it's been really interesting to see people get together and start to work on a lot of these different issues. And we've run into different sorts of roadblocks as well. And so what we're doing right now is continuing to work with these groups to figure out what they can do collectively as a community to raise awareness about pesticide resistance, to better facilitate best management practices, and to kind of share resources and share knowledge. But we're also trying to figure out what the barriers are to these community groups being more effective. And one of them that's come up is definitely issues of rural development and how many people are in the community and whether those people actually have the time to meet and how geographically distant they are. That's definitely been something. And then also how overwhelmed a lot of farmers are and other stakeholders are with other demands. So if it's not an issue that's right on your doorstep that's kind of on fire, you have a lot of other issues that are. So how do you dedicate time to that? That's been a very difficult thing to overcome in a lot of ways. But we are trying and we'll see. So I have a variety of projects right now that are focused on learning how we can enhance these communities and essentially hopefully do this better in a lot of ways. And there's an interesting example coming out of Washington State, where Washington State University is doing this community monitoring program with weather stations and gathering community data Really excited about that. And then I also have an NSF grant with a variety of weed scientists and sociologists and entomologists as well, looking at how we can potentially understand previous community management efforts like the Arkansas Zero Tolerance Program and why they were successful versus some that tried to start and weren't as successful. And maybe we can learn some lessons from that to figure out how to better give different communities the resources that they need to have these conversations and to start managing resistance in a more collective way. Okay, so it's been 25 minutes and I want to make sure that I leave enough time for questions. So I will open it up to that, and I am more than happy to answer any questions about the program and about my research.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Dentzman. That was great. As an ag engineer, I learned a lot, found it very interesting. I think there are things we can relate to some of our work on conservation BMPs. All right, so we do have I think a couple other slides here that I'll go over before we get
Oh,
to the
yeah,
questions. We've gotten a couple
go
of
ahead.
questions in there. So first, if you watch this webinar live and you want to earn a CCA CEU, please email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. Again, Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu. And the demographic slide. Okay, if you watch this webinar live, and you're willing to fill out this voluntary demographic survey, we would really appreciate it. You can scan that QR code. Only one survey response is needed for all 2024 webinars. So if you have watched a webinar this year and done the voluntary demographic survey, thank you so very much. If you haven't and are willing to do that, that would be fabulous. Scan the QR code or go to iowalearningfarms.org/survey. And then put in a bit of a plug for the webinar next week. We have Brian Emmett, Dr. Brian Emmett, that's a research biologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service, National Laboratory for Agriculture and the Environment, is going to talk about partners below ground, opportunities for management of plant fungal symbiosis. So that's a little different topic than we talked about today, but we're going to think below ground. Maybe some of that might even have impact in the future on weeds. So, okay, Katie, we got some questions here. The first one was they were curious how much geography might affect some of the findings.
Mm.
That is, would there be big differences between your findings in Iowa or other I states or Oklahoma or other fringe acres?
Yeah, absolutely. So we did do some geographic comparisons, and they were really, really interesting. And a lot of it seemed to have to do with how bad resistance was in that area. And so we were seeing growers in Georgia, for instance, who were much more disillusioned with kind of this techno-optimism idea because they had experienced resistance and they tried kind of everything and it was still going. And it was much more of kind of a fatalistic attitude, which was really interesting to me, as opposed to in Iowa, they were like, actually, we're kind of looking at what the people in Georgia are doing, and we're worried that that's going to come hit us. So how can we maybe be more proactive around that? And then obviously different things matter as far as the agronomic system and the geography of the land. So I worked out in Washington and Idaho for a variety of years. And it was a very different environment out there in terms of working together as a community to manage pesticide resistance. They're very, very concerned about tillage. They have highly erodible land. It's very hilly. It's also not an irrigated system. It's a dry land system. So there are a lot of different elements going into how people coordinated there. And they used a lot of their soil conservation networks in interesting ways that had already been established. So I think that geography definitely matters in a lot of ways.
So there's one here, and you may be familiar with this, but there's some work done by Lois Wright Morton that looked at
Mhm.
kind of communities coming together on water quality issues. And I think one of the things they came out with some of those pilots is that they sometimes could struggle with self-governance, and they may function better if there was some sort of coordinator. Perhaps we can learn something from those experiences, even though it wasn't pest control. And so I guess kind of related in those four pilots, are those all self-governed right now, or is there a specific, person in charge or?
Yeah, so basically, Iowa State is trying to play that role of a
Okay.
coordinator or a facilitator. And we're doing that. It's not necessarily one person so much as it is a team. And one
Okay.
of the issues right now is that I'm one of the only team members left.
Okay.
And
Oh, oh no.
and I don't have an extension appointment. So it's kind of hard for
Okay.
me to be that person.
Okay.
But we have in the past had people, and I've actually been having some really interesting discussions with the university about who we might hire to be that person and to have a position that is really dedicated to being that coordinator. Because I think that's a really important point is that we don't want to just like, throw something at these communities like, hey, you should engage and then leave and never help. Like that's not the goal. The goal is to let the communities lead and govern, but also to be there as a resource and to be there as a coordinator and a facilitator and somebody that they can ask questions to and that can guide them to different resources and to kind of help provide that network of connections as well. So absolutely, I think that's super important. And I saw a related question
Yeah.
from Leland that was, Iowa experienced very poor support for water quality best management practices. Can we realistically say that a similar approach will work for pest resistance? And I think that's a really interesting question that I'd be interested in delving into. But one of my initial thoughts on it is that pest resistance is more visible. So some of the work that I do centers around aesthetics and good farming and what people can see versus what they cannot see. And even within pesticide resistance, this is interestingly relevant because when you can see weeds physically in your field versus if it's a bug or something that just moves through. So we've had people talking about corn rootworm, and it's like, well, it's a lot less obvious. And if you drive past that field, you might never know that they have this problem. So the visibility of it, weirdly, I think matters in a significant way. But we also have been trying to figure out like, how do we do it when people can't see it or when it's not a problem yet? So definitely a question and a problem that we're working on.
Yeah. Okay. So here was one. How much success do you think you can attribute to a particular program like the Arkansas Zero Tolerance Program versus just being the right group of people getting together in the right time and place?
Yeah, absolutely. And that absolutely matters, right? Is that you have the right people involved. But I think part of the initiative of a community group like this is to find those right people. And I think there's a variety of different ways to do that, right? And so this is something that me and a couple of the other sociologists on the Iowa Pest Resistance Management Program have been studying. Because sometimes in some communities, there's like one key person, right? And that key person is somebody that has a lot of social capital and people really rally around. In some communities, there's not that key person. And that might actually be more effective in some ways if you can get a couple people to take different roles. So I don't know. I mean, I think it's an open question, but part of what I've been trying to design is basically a guide. And that would be a questionnaire or a template that communities can use together to ask the right kinds of questions. So that goes back to kind of, is there a coordinator? Is there a facilitator? How do we work through these things? And I think that, taking the research that we've been doing and putting it together into kind of a toolkit that communities can use to work through these problems could be potentially an effective way of getting through some of that.
Okay. This may be somewhat related, but there's a question here. Has there been any consideration on whether other farm-oriented community organizing efforts, or maybe even faith communities, could tackle other issues to take advantage of communities that are already established?
Absolutely. I think that is a fantastic point. And that was something that we really tied into when I was out in Washington and Idaho. So the soil conservation districts were very on board with that. Or there were weed boards, state weed boards that were really interested in potentially getting involved. I think it'd be really interesting to look at communities of faith as well. I actually worked with a student here, a graduate student at Iowa State University, who is majoring in theater and was also majoring in sustainable agriculture, which I thought was a fascinating combination. And he was in one of my classes, and I was like, oh, this is so interesting. And it turned out that he was doing his thesis as writing a play about herbicide resistance in a community and the kind of tensions that it was causing. And so I went and
Oh,
saw his play, which was really, really good. And it was set in the basement of a church. And it was all of these people who are coming together at this church who had different perspectives, but were all kind of tied together by this social network in their community and were able to hash out some of these questions. And I thought that was really, really interesting because I do think there needs to be kind of these informal gathering places, these already established networks that we could tie into that might be really relevant for making these conversations easier and not reinventing the wheel in some
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah, somebody brought up one group might be the Iowa Power and Light, might be an
Hmm,
organization that um
absolutely.
yeah.
Yep.
Okay, a few more questions here. Are there any findings from the 4 pilot studies yet? And if not, maybe we can get like get you hooked in that you could come back and give a webinar on that when you do have some.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have done a couple presentations on some of the findings from the studies. I haven't published anything yet, but I do have a different presentation on some of that. And that presentation actually revolves around why some of the pilot communities have kind of stalled out. So it's not necessarily a presentation that's like, wow, look at all these amazing successes, but it's more of a presentation of here's some of the roadblocks that we've hit, and here's some of the ways that we might overcome them. So hopefully we'll have something on that published fairly soon, fingers
Okay.
crossed. But yeah.
Then when you do, then we're going to circle back and get you on here. Hopefully you're willing, you'll accept the invitation from Elena again.
Mhm.
Um, there was another one. Would financial incentives for pilots help get
Mm.
more farmers involved, and might there be opportunities in the Farm Bill?
Absolutely. I think that would be a really fascinating way to go. And we talk about incentives quite a bit in a lot of my groups, and what incentives might look like and how those things might play out. And one concern that people have with that is if they're already doing all of these best management practices, then they can't often be rewarded for them because you're not doing anything new. So that is a concern. But I have talked fairly extensively with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, NRCS, about their different conservation enhancement programs. And they have been very interested in potentially offering a conservation enhancement related to resistance management. So they currently have one in Iowa that they're working on at the state level, looking at integrated pest management. And that's been shared with me and is essentially, a laundry list, a pick list kind of different practices that you can do in order to get this conservation enhancement. And there's been interest expressed in making that relevant to resistance management as well. And so I'm really interested in talking to growers about how that might work best for them. Because I do agree that, incentive programs can work in some ways, but there's also evidence that like when you do an incentive program, people do the thing you're incentivizing,
Hmm.
but when you stop paying them, they stop. So there's,
Yeah.
a lot going on there in terms of is it actually changing people's mindsets? Where is this money going? But I do think that there is definitely some potential in that venue.
So there was somebody that asked, how can a small landowner or citizen help farmers take action?
Oh man, that's a great question. I think really what farmers have said to me as far as how they want to interact with the public more is just to have more conversations with people. And I think that this is something that we can do. And I had a lot of farmers saying, well, people get upset with me because they don't know the situation that I'm in. So just being able to go to meetings, if there are open meetings, being able to chat with farmers about what they're experiencing, I think is going to build some of those community ties that are going to be really important to managing things as a group. And so if there are opportunities to like go and talk to people, to get engaged, I think that the more we can build those networks, the more effective things are going to be.
There was a question. They wondered if that play is out as a movie yet. This sounds very interesting and will bring this subject to the general population.
Yeah, not
Wait,
yet.
no,
Unfortunately, I would love
yeah,
that.
we need an evening where we have that play on herbicide resistance and then the Water Rocks the musical afterwards. We can
Oh, yes.
that's sounds like a good opportunity for education on multiple fronts.
Yeah, I've been trying to convince my student that he needs to do like a little traveling play around
Yeah,
Iowa,
yeah,
but
yeah.
we'll see. We'll see.
Okay, all right. Um, okay. So I guess, yeah, this is one that, do you think trying to do this on a community basis might be more successful than maybe what's been seen on the water quality front to date? Because, farmers may feel more invested in the outcomes of this, maybe in part because, like you said, they really see it with the weeds out in their fields.
Yeah, I think that that is definitely relevant because it's a very obvious visual and economic impact, right? You can see and you can really feel it in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
You can physically feel it and you can feel it in your pocketbook as well. So I think that that might be kind of an interesting starting point. But I do think that some of these approaches can also be kind of transcribed into other issues. So if you have a community that's already together, and again, if we tap into an existing community that can talk about herbicide resistance, great. But if we have a community talking about herbicide resistance, at some point, can they also talk about water quality issues, right? And so if herbicide resistance is what brings them to the table, fantastic. But then if there's other community issues that we can address while we're there, I think that would also be really relevant. But it also kind of comes back to that like that visualization and point and non-point source kind of things. Even with water quality, it's very difficult to regulate a lot of this because it's just not visual in a lot of ways.
Mhm.
So something that we're actually trying with corn rootworm, because another kind of similar issue where it's hard to visualize, is there's been some really fascinating work that Erin Hodgson, she's an entomologist here at Iowa
Yeah.
State, has been doing, yeah, as far as like community action and getting like sticky cards out and actually tracking the presence of corn rootworm and making maps and publicly available data to track these kinds of things. And there's actually a really interesting data analysis system at Washington State that an entomologist there is working on, where they're tracking instances of infestations of different pests and then making a publicly available map of these different infestations over time. And it's aggregated data, so you can't get down to like the farm level, so it's all private. But individual farmers can request their specific data. And so they can track the prevalence of this pest and kind of how it's ebbed and flowed throughout different seasons for them. And so I think different ways of helping visualize the issue and making it more apparent to people would be a way to help with some of these issues that we're talking about around water quality as well.
Okay. Thanks. And okay, maybe one last one here in the interest of time. Is there any work that's looked at, whether rented ground is an issue for community weed control?
So we actually did look at that because we had
Okay.
the same thought.
Okay.
And we are hearing that in our focus groups too, of like maybe it's different on rented than owned land. And that is true for some conservation practices, especially when you're talking about things that are a really big investment and that physically change the land. Those can be difficult for renters to invest in. So we ran some statistics and some regressions, and funnily enough, we found no difference between
Okay.
owned and rented
All
land,
right.
which was fascinating to me. And I think part of what might be going on there is that, and this comes from the focus groups and what people were telling me, is when you own the land, you're obviously concerned about the quality and passing it down and keeping it in good shape. But a lot of people who are renting were saying, if you have a terrible resistance infestation, you're not going to be renting that land for long. Right. And so there was a lot of awareness that, you want your fields to look clean, you want to have them well under control so you can keep renting that land into the future. So interestingly, I think maybe those things are balancing out and we're seeing fairly similar concern across owned and rented ground.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, Katie. This was really interesting presentation. I'm glad it was
Thank
well
you.
worth the wait. Again, if
Good.
you have need a CCA CEU, email Elena Whitaker, ALENAW at iastate.edu by 5 o'clock today with your name, the name you entered to watch the webinar, and your CCA number. And please tune in next week for Dr. Brian Emmett. We're going to go below ground there. So thank you so much again, Katie.